Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. The wind came in sheets that day, pushing grit through the seams of Dry Creek like a thin-bladed knife. Hinges rasped on the livery. A church bell clanged twice, uneven as an old man's cough. Clara stood on the edge of town with a flour sack slung over her shoulder and the rest of her belongings stitched into the hem of her dress. 2 coins, a single-button locket, and a buttonhook that would later pass for a knife if she pretended hard enough. She pressed her palm to the subtle swell of her belly and told the child, softly, "We're walking." No one stopped her. A few watched. Mrs. Pike folded her arms in the doorway of the mercantile, lips thin. The town's doctor, a sober man who preferred numbers to words, kept his eyes down as if the sight of Clara might give him fever. Will Stokes, who had once stood with a ring in his hand and promises in his mouth, leaned against the hitch rail with a cigarette that never reached his lips. He wore the look of a man who had escaped a disaster by a step and now wished to seem wise. For it, when Clara passed, he did not speak. She didn't either. There was nothing in her throat but dust. Beyond Dry Creek, the land opened like a fist slowly unclenching. Sagebrush in low mounds, blue grama grass high and whispering, a scatter of prickly pear, each pad studded with spines as bright as needles, fresh from the package. The sky was so big it looked like it might tilt and spill. Clara hitched the flour sack higher and began to count steps the way she had once counted stitches, finding a rhythm that turned distance into a craft. She had left at noon to prove to herself she wasn't afraid of the day's heat. By mid-afternoon, her cheeks burned and the bones of her back felt as if they were grinding against stone. When she found shade, it was the mean sort, thin and trembling beneath the branches of a cottonwood that clung to a trickle of water like a promise no one believed. She drank with both hands, not from any tin cup, just her fingers curled to cradle. What the creek would give. A dragonfly lit on the back of her knuckles and looked her over, cocked-eyed and curious, then vanished. Clara drank again and spoke to the child. "We'll make camp with the first good stand of juniper," she said, "and if not that, then with the second." She walked on, and the land went on with her dot. In the late light, she found a shelf of sandstone tucked behind a spill of basalt, and decided it looked like a bed. She struck a sulfur match against her boot, coaxed a small fire from gathered twigs, and set a kettle to boil on 3 rocks. The water came to a grumpy simmer, and she dropped in a pinch of coffee grounds she had measured that morning with miser's accuracy. As the light thinned, coyotes tuned their voices. 1 took the high part, 2 answered low. Clara's hand kept finding her belly without her bidding. "Little one," she said, "I may not know how to choose friends, but I know how to go forward. The first night out of any place is the hardest." That much she had learned from girls in town who had run away and returned with their pride folded up like a handkerchief. But returning wasn't a possibility she wore. Pride can be heavy and hunger can be real, yet Clara's stubbornness had the animal shape of necessity. She had been told, in a kitchen that smelled of yeast and sun-baked wood, that she was a problem. Will Stokes had said the word like it was something she'd cooked and set on the table without asking his appetite. "A problem," he'd said. Again, lips thin, eyes anywhere else. His mother had stood behind him, arms folded like a fence. The judgment had been smoothed into politeness by his careful tone, but the meaning had stood up on its hind legs and shown its teeth. Clara had folded her apron, hung it on the peg by habit, and walked out the door before her legs heard about it from her heart. On the second day, she learned to ration without thinking. She took bites and not mouthfuls. She drank when she must, and swished water in her mouth when she wanted. In the distance a freight wagon crawled east, canvas flapping like the throat of a sail. Clara stepped off the faint road to let it pass and lifted her hand in greeting. The driver nodded, looked at her belly, looked away. "Storm 'fore sundown," he said, as if he owed the information to anyone on two legs. "I'll find a cut." She answered. Even her voice sounded like it had left town dot. By afternoon, the horizon went the color of iron. Wind kicked up grit, and the grit made needles of her eyes. She found what the driver had called a cutta shallow wash braided through, with cottonwoods and wild rose, and hunkered there while the weather scolded the land above. Rain came in sheets that didn't quite touch, like someone trying to be careful with a breakable. The smell of wet dust rose and wrapped around her with a feral sweetness that almost felt like mercy. She pulled her shawl over her head and counted. Heartbeats until the growl of thunder moved off. When she climbed out of the wash, the world had been rewritten. The air was rinsed. The sky went clean as bone. Fresh tracks showed where before there had been none. A scatter of mule deer prints. 3 sets of boot heels. A pair of narrow-hoofed mustangs. Clara crouched to look without the pretense of expertise only. To know. The boot heels were close together and deep. Men walking with purpose, not drifting. "Not our concern," she told the child, and made it a rule for that hour got. She started seeing signs of the Lakota around then too, not people, but the sort of prints that told a story if you met them halfway. A willow switch cut clean. A discarded shaving of buffalo horn, thin as a fingernail. Horse droppings compact and fresh, with grass still bright in them. Clara's grandmother, who had crossed the plains west and then back east in the same wagon. When the crops failed, used to say, "The prairie speaks any language you'll listen for." Clara listened. She was not afraid of neighbors she hadn't yet met. She was afraid of men who called themselves her neighbors and used the word ours. Toward evening, hungry in the particular way that makes the navels of your feelings feel. Hollow, Clara came upon a stranded windmill with its tail twisted askew and its legs half sunk in dried mud. Beneath it, a trough lay tilted full of splinters and shadows. She climbed the windmill's wooden ladder 3 rungs and leaned her head into the lattice to breathe in the ghost of water. That breath turned into a laugh that surprised her as, much as any sob, she could still be made to laugh by an absence, behaving like a promise. She camped beneath a juniper that night and stitched a tear in her hem by firelight. On the 3rd day, she woke before the sun and tasted horsemint on the air, sharp as a match head. The prairie was quiet in the way a church is quiet, when everyone is praying at once. She ate her last heel of bread, stubbornly slow, and set off. Under a sky with a rib cage of clouds dot by mid-morning, the land began to fold into itself. Mesas rose like the backs of sleeping beasts, and the path thinned to a suggestion. A hawk stitched figure eights overhead, its shadow cutting over sage, over stone, over Clara's face, swift as a hand. She put her palm against her belly and felt the faint answering flutter that might have been life or fear or both. "You're not alone," she said, and realized she meant it for herself too. She first heard them as a disturbance in the normal, a snag in the cloth. The sounds came braided together, the slap of rope against something that struggled, a man's voice shaped into command, the small bright sound of a child's cry being swallowed by obedience. Clara dropped into the lee of a boulder before her. Body registered the choice. She swallowed dust and listened harder. The voices were in English, not all of them from the same mouth. She picked out the rough laughter of men who believed the world about to give them what it owed. Beneath that, a language she did not know, quick and steady like a stream speaking around stones. She belly crawled up the slope to the rim of a shallow basin. The land on the far side fell away into a pocket lined with rabbit brush and cottonwood, a small green gasp in all that tan. From her perch, Clara saw the scene nested below as if a cruel hand had arranged it for a picture. 4 men in dust-stiff hats, their shirts unbuttoned to the sternum, stood with rifles slung and boots planted wide. One had a face like a busted fence. Another kept scratching his jaw, as if the hair there belonged to someone else. Weighted nets lay thrown and drawn, pinning a man to the ground as if the earth itself had closed over him. He was Lakota. Clara knew that much, not from the exact shape of a name, but from the bright quilt of his daughter's dress and the way he held his body, even bound, with a balance that made stillness look like a choice. 2 little girls were tangled near him, their hands trapped in the cords. One wept without sound, tears bright as beads. The other had her mouth pressed flat and her eyes narrowed to slits, as if she could cut the world with them if she found the right angle. The men with rifles laughed and kicked at the net's edges, drawing them tighter. "Fetch us our price," said the one with the fence face. "Big Jake pays double for trouble." "Big Jake pays double for nothing," the jaw-scratcher answered. "But he pays." Clara's pulse went hard and hollow. Her first thought rose. Out of the old life like a bad habit. Not your business. Not your affair. Then the second, which felt like a hand she recognized. Those are children. The 2 thoughts collided in her ribs and made a third. If not you, who? She slid back from the rim and pressed her spine to the cool side of the boulder. Her breath came tight and high, like she'd run when she hadn't. She made herself breathe. Lower, hand on belly, palm flattening and rising. "Listen," she told the child, because talking steadied her. "We do this quiet or not at all." For a minute that stretched itself thin, she inventoried her life. A flour sack, a kettle, a shawl, button-hook, locket, 2 coins that wouldn't bribe a conscience. She thought of Mrs. Pike's mouth. She thought of Will Stokes' silence. She thought of how quickly a person's name could go from tender to ash inside that silence. Then she thought of the girl's eyes, the moment the net had pulled close. One bright with tears, one sharp with fury. She knew those 2 kinds of looking. She had worn both. Clara flattened herself and wormed along the ridge until she could see the men's horses' 4 animals ground tied in the shade of a cottonwood. Reins looped low, reins that would tangle feet if startled. A length of spare. Rope hung from a saddle horn. She marked the distance between the horses and the men by counting heartbeats, then made a different plan, because sometimes the wrong plan came easier. There was a place in the basin where the rabbit brush grew higher, and the ground dipped behind it. If she could slide down there, she could reach the nets without being seen, unless a man turned just right. She tested the slope with one knee and an elbow, felt pebbles skitter, waited. "No," shout rose. She moved another body's width, then another. A grasshopper leaped and landed on her sleeve, its saw leg rasping like a file. She flicked it away with a breath, because hands felt too expensive. Closer now. Clara could hear the girl's breath, a pair of small, wet hummingbird sounds. She could hear the man speak in the language she didn't know, voice low, steady. The words might have been names or promises or instructions. She could not understand their bones, but she knew their marrow. And men with the rifles were less. Careful with their tongues. "Hold still," one mocked. "Ain't no sense in wriggling." Clara looked for the knots. The net had been thrown and then tightened with cinches at the edges, drawn up like sacks. Where cord crossed cord, the friction burned the strands into something like bone. A knife would have been a mercy. She didn't have a knife. She had a button-hook steel, small, curved. It was meant for loops and eyelets and patience. She had those more or less. She reached into her dress pocket, found the button-hook by feel, and willed her hand not to shake. If one of the men turned, he would see her arm. If one of the girls gasped, the grass would tell. Clara slid the hook under a knot and turned her wrist, forcing a gap where there had been none. The cord bit her finger. She bit her lip back. A strand snapped, as loud to her as thunder. She froze. No one looked. The man under the net went stiller than before. His eyes lifted and found her. They were dark, not with threat, but with the steadiness of someone who knows what silence can do. He shifted his shoulder minutely, making room for her hand. Clara slid the hook again, curling and levering, teasing one loop through another the way she had once freed a baby bird from a horsehair noose by a creek bank. A second fiber gave. The net slackened a finger's width. She swallowed and tried for a third, counting the men's jokes as cover each, laugh a curtain. A hand of fear pressed her sternum. She did not ask herself why she was doing this. She did not calculate the price. Her body had been told by rooms, by looks, by a ring withheld, that it did not belong to her. Now, in this basin scored by wind and root, she discovered that some parts of her answered only to her own voice. She breathed, so low that the sound was more idea than air. She worked one knot, then another. The button-hook's metal warmed in her fingers. A fly landed on her cheek and plotted there like a blunt thought. She let it, because swatting would be a flag. A bead of blood swelled at the pad of her index finger where the cord had burned through. She let that be too. Work. Breathe. Listen. Work. A boot scuffed. One of the men wandered toward the cottonwood to spit. He turned his head, and Clara went dead still. A blade slid back into its sheath. A man scratched his jaw, spat, then turned. Away, calling for a flask. Laughter answered. The girls stayed silent, taught either by life or by the father's eyes. The father watched Clara with a kind of attention that had no grab in it. That steadied her more than any prayer dot by the time. The sun touched the lip of the western mesa. Clara had opened a rip big enough for a man who knew how to move without announcement. She eased her hand free and retreated inch by inch into the brush, heart a tom-tom in her throat. The men drank. One told a story about a horse that would not be broke. Another measured coin in the air with his fingers as if the size of his greed. Might make a true dot. Clara slid back up the slope to her original perch and lay with her chest against the hot stone, watching the basin as a new animal. The plan, if that was what to call a wish that had found hands, wasn't finished. The nets would have to be torn the rest of the way at the right moment, when the men were loudest and least vigilant, when horses could be spooked, when shadows would give more to the moving than to the still. She wiped her bloody finger on her skirt and did not look at the stain. She did not look at Dry Creek, either its church bell, its windows full of faces pretending not to look. She looked at the girls who had not wailed and the father who had not begged. She looked at the nets, heavy with their own certainty. She looked at the button-hook in her hand and thought it might be a knife after all, if a person held it in the right story. Tonight, she told the child under her hand, voice as steady as she could make it, we'll finish what we started. Below, the men's fire caught and climbed. Sparks went up like little worlds burning, then went out. The basin filled with the small sounds night carries without complaint. The tap of a beetle, the rattle of dry seed pods, the creak of leather settling. Clara breathed in smoke until it felt like her own breath. She reached for the hem where she'd hidden the coins and thought of buying choices with them later salt. Thread, a clean shirt. Then she tucked the thoughts away because later was a country you had to cross to deserve. The moon shouldered up over the far ridge, wide and pale as a peeled apple. In its light, the nets gleamed faintly. Spider silk turned to chain. The girls' faces became ovals of milk. The father tilted his head once, fractionally, as if testing the night's listening. Clara touched the button-hook to her lips as if it were a word and began to slide, quiet as a second chance, back down toward the nets. The moon had risen higher by the time Clara reached the bottom of the basin. It cast long shadows from the cottonwoods, turning their trunks into bars like those of a cage. She crouched in the brush, breathing through her mouth so even her breath might stay hidden, and listened to the rhythm of the bounty men. They were 4 in all. Their boots stamped restlessly, their laughter came in bursts, and their voices rolled like dice, careless, uneven, but always with an edge of menace. One man, the one who had spat earlier, was already drunk, slurring half his words and waving his tin cup until whiskey slopped over the rim. Another stoked the fire with a stick, snapping twigs so the sparks popped and leapt like fireflies startled from grass. Their rifles leaned against saddles only a few yards away, forgotten in the warmth of the blaze and the haze of drink. Clara pressed her palm against the dry earth and steadied herself. She was close enough now to hear the girl's breathing, quick, shallow, but controlled, as though someone had taught them not to waste a breath on panic. The warrior, their father, lay still under the weight of the net. His chest rose and fell steadily, though his shoulders strained against the cords with each breath. His eyes, dark and alert, found Clara again as they had before. This time, in the silver light of the moon, they were sharper, more alive, carrying something that steadied her own heart. Clara waited. She had learned long ago that stillness was a kind of weapon. As a child, she had hidden from her father's temper by making herself small and silent, invisible in the corners of their small house. That same skill born of fear now became her shield. The bounty men talked louder, and their laughter turned rough. At last she moved. On her knees, she crawled through the brush, letting the stems of rabbit brush snag her dress, so the sound of her movement was swallowed in the wind. Her hand gripped the button hook, its metal now slick with the sweat of her palm. She slid closer until she could reach the net's edge. She whispered to the warrior, so low it was nearly a breath. He gave the faintest nod. His daughters had already gone silent, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Clara pushed the hook under the knot and worked. The rope was thick, braided from horsehair and hemp, and it bit into her fingers when she pulled. She sawed and twisted, each fiber resisting, each one giving only when her whole hand ached. She thought of the child inside her, safe beneath her ribs, and found strength she did not know she still carried. The first strand gave way with a faint snap. Clara froze, waiting for one of the men to notice. But their laughter rolled on, covering the sound. She moved to the next knot, her hands trembling with the urgency of the moment. Sweat slid down her temples. Her knees burned against the rocks. The warrior's eyes never left her hands. Another strand broke. Then another. The net slackened just enough for the warrior to shift his shoulders. Clara glanced at him, and he understood. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled against the sia. Cords at the same time she pried them loose. The fibers groaned, then frayed. Together, silently, they worked like two hands of the same body. The daughters pressed closer, their small hands resting against Clara's skirt, as though her touch alone might promise safety. She whispered to them without words, brushing her fingers against their tangled hair, urging them to wait, to hold still. They did. When she had worked halfway through the knots, her strength faltered. Her fingers were raw, her palm blistered from the pull of the hook. For a moment, the weight of it all pressed down on her rejection, her exile, her hunger, her unborn child. She nearly dropped the tool. But then the youngest girl, the one with the doll still clutched in her small hand, touched Clara's belly with her tiny fingers. She didn't speak, but the gesture was simple, pure, a recognition of something shared between them. Clara's breath caught. She bent back to the knots, fiercer than before. The warrior tensed his arms. With one last surge, the weakened cords snapped. The net slumped loose around him. He gathered his daughters into his arms in one swift motion, rising to his knees without a sound. His movements were fluid, like a river unblocked. Clara stepped back, pressing herself into the brush got at that moment. The drunk bounty man let out a howl of laughter and flung his cup into the fire. Sparks leapt high. The warrior seized the chance. With a powerful motion, he tore the rest of the net away and slipped into the shadows of the brush. Clara followed, crouched low, her skirts whispering against the grass. They moved as one, silent as owls in flight. Behind them, the bounty men laughed and cursed, still blind to their escape. Clara dared not breathe until they had cleared the basin and scrambled up the ridge on the far side dot at the top. She collapsed to her knees, heart hammering so hard she thought the men might hear it from below. The warrior stood beside her, his daughters pressed against his legs, their small arms wrapped around him. He turned to Clara. In the moonlight, his face was strong, proud, but his eyes held something gentler gratitude, perhaps, or astonishment. Pressed a hand against her belly, gasping for breath. The warrior spoke, his words soft and low. She did not understand the language, but she understood the tone. A thank you given without condition. Below, the bounty men finally noticed their empty nets. Their voices rose in fury, echoing through the basin. But Clara, the warrior, and the girls were already moving, their silhouettes swallowed by the night. The knife in her hand was nothing but a button-hook, yet in the quiet it had become a blade, sharp enough to cut a family free. Clara knew then that something inside her had shifted. She was no longer only a woman cast aside. She was a rescuer, a conspirator in freedom, bound now to the strangers she had saved, and in that bond she felt for the first time in months like she belonged. The prairie opened before them like a sea of silver. Moonlight washed across the land, making each blade of grass a pale shimmer, each rock a black tooth in the earth. Clara stumbled at first, her legs stiff from crouching so long, her belly heavy with the weight of her unborn child. The warrior moved as if the shadows themselves carried him forward, his daughters cradled close against his chest. They made no sound except the whisper of their breath and the faint rustle of their skirts. Clara hurried to keep pace, though each step jarred her bones and sent a sharp ache up her spine. She did not complain. She did not even think the word pain. All she thought of was distance. Distance between them and the basin. Distance between them and the fury of men who would not forgive the theft of their prey. When at last the land sloped upward into a shallow ridge, the warrior stopped. He set his daughters down gently, speaking to them in a low tone Clara did not know but could nearly feel in her bones. The older girl nodded solemnly, pressing her doll into the crook of her arm as though it were a talisman. The younger clung to her father's leg, but he stroked her hair, patient and tender even in flight. He turned to Clara then. His face was unreadable, save for the glint of his eyes. He gestured to the ridge behind them, then pointed eastward, where the land fell, away into darker valleys. His meaning was clear enough. They must move quickly, but not blindly. Clara wiped the sweat from her forehead. "Yes," she whispered, though he would not understand her words. She pointed too, mimicking him, and together they began again. The prairie was not quiet. Crickets throbbed in the grasses, and night birds cried from hidden perches. A coyote yipped somewhere far off, its voice taken up by another, then another, until it seemed the land itself sang of hunger. To Clara's ears, each sound was a warning bell. She kept glancing over her shoulder, certain she would see lantern light or hear hoofbeats. But the night remained theirs alone, at least for now. Her body weakened with the miles. By the third ridge her breath rasped and her steps dragged. She pressed her hands against her lower back, trying to ease the ache that spread like fire across her hips. She thought of sitting down, just for a moment. But then the older girl's hand slipped into hers, small and warm, and Clara's resolve hardened. If a child could walk without complaint, so could she, the warrior noticed. He slowed his pace slightly, never looking back outright, but measuring his steps against hers. She realized he was matching her rhythm, accommodating her without dishonoring. Her pride, gratitude swelled in her chest, but she said nothing. Silence was safer than words. By the time dawn began to pale the horizon, they had found a hollow among tall rocks where the wind sighed but did not pierce. The warrior guided his daughters into the shelter and gestured for Clara to sit. She sank to the ground gratefully, her back pressed against the cool stone, her palms splayed on the dirt as though the earth itself might lend her strength. The daughters curled beside her, their dark heads resting against her arm as if she were kin. Clara blinked, startled by the intimacy of the gesture, then softened. She shifted so that the girls could rest more easily, her own hand drifting protectively to her belly. The warrior crouched a short distance away, his gaze scanning the open land. He seemed to belong to it, as though he were part of the stone and wind. After a long moment, he turned to her. "Vikasa," he said, pressing his hand to his chest. Clara frowned slightly, not sure what he meant. He repeated it, slower this time, his eyes steady on hers. Then she understood. His name. Vikasa, she echoed softly, the unfamiliar syllables heavy on her tongue. He nodded once. Then he touched the heads of his daughters in turn, speaking. Their names. Clara did her best to repeat them, stumbling over the sounds but trying. The older girl grinned at her clumsy attempt, her eyes suddenly bright, while the younger giggled, muffling the sound against her father's sleeve. Finally, they looked to her. She hesitated. Her name had been a burden in Dry Creek, spat like a curse or muttered with pity. Yet here, in the open land, she felt no shame. Clara, she said quietly, touching her chest. Vesa inclined his head in acknowledgement, and his daughters whispered her name to themselves as though tasting a sweet. For the first time in weeks, Clara's heart felt lighter than her steps. They shared what little they had. Vikasa drew from a pouch a handful of dried meat and berries, passing it to his daughters first, then to Clara. She tried to refuse, gesturing to her belly as excuse, but he pressed the food into her hand firmly, his eyes brooking no argument. She ate, humbled. In return, she unwrapped her small bundle of bread crusts and offered them. The children accepted with solemnity, chewing as though it were a feast. Clara smiled faintly, though tears pricked her eyes. She had been abandoned. With less kindness than this. As the sun climbed, they slept in shifts. Vikasa rested with his daughters, while Clara kept watch, her hand never leaving the buttonhook she still carried like a talisman. When it was her turn to rest, she dreamed of nets falling from the sky, of hands pulling her under, of her child, tangled in cords she could not cut. She woke with a gasp, and Vikasa's steady gaze reassured her. The second night they traveled again. The stars were fierce and endless above them, the Milky Way like a spilled trail of salt. Clara found herself speaking softly to the child in her belly, not in fear but in wonder. "Do you see it?" she whispered. "You'll grow under skies like this." The older daughter, walking beside her, tilted her head curiously, as if she understood enough to know Clara was speaking of hope. She slipped her hand into Clara's again, and Clara let her, but hope was fragile. Near midnight, Vikasa stopped abruptly. He crouched low, pressing his ear to the ground. Clara held her breath, watching. After a moment, he lifted his head, his eyes narrowed. Then he whispered a single word, harsh and clipped. Though Clara could not understand, she did not need to. The meaning was clear in his tense shoulders. Pursuit? She turned her gaze to the horizon. In the far distance, faint as a candle flickering. A light moved, a lantern, then another. The bounty men had found their trail. By the time the second dawn stretched her pale fingers across the prairie, Clara's legs shook under her, and every step sent fire into her hips. Her belly had grown taut with strain, the child restless within, as if stirred by her mother's racing pulse. Still, she pressed forward, her eyes fixed on the silhouettes of Vikasa and his daughters, who moved with the silent surety of deer across the grassland dot behind them. Faint but steady came the sound of pursuit. The bounty men had horses now. The rhythm of hooves carried on the wind, too far to see, but close enough that Clara's body understood before her mind did. Every thud pressed urgency into her blood. She tasted iron in her mouth. Vikasa stopped at the edge of a ravine, scanning the land ahead. He crouched, placed his daughters beside him, and studied the canyon that split the prairie in two. It was a ragged wound in the earth, with walls of sandstone rising sharp as teeth and a narrow floor tangled with rocks. To cross would be to enter a trap. To linger would be to surrender. Clara stared at the chasm. The wind whistled through it, carrying the smell of dust and sage. She had grown up afraid of places like this, where the earth seemed to swallow sound. But she read the truth in Vikasa's eyes. They had no choice. He pointed toward the canyons. Bend where shadows pooled deepest. His meaning was clear enough. They would hide there, perhaps use the walls themselves as a weapon. Clara nodded, though fear pressed hard against her ribs. The descent was brutal. The children clung to their father's shoulders, while Clara scrambled, her skirts catching on jagged stone. She slipped once, skinning her palms, but caught herself before she fell. At the bottom, the air was cooler, thick with the scent of stone that had been buried for ages. The walls loomed high, cutting off the horizon, leaving only a ribbon of sky. Wicasa guided them to a ledge where they crouched, half hidden by brush. He pressed a finger to his lips, though none of them needed reminding. Silence had become their companion. Clara's chest heaved. She curled a protective arm over her belly, whispering to the child within, "Just a little longer. Just a little." Stronger. Above them, the hoofbeats grew louder. Stones rattled loose from the canyon's rim, tumbling down with sharp cracks. Clara dared not look up, but she imagined the men there, scanning the ravine with lanterns, their greedy eyes searching for shadows that breathed. The daughters pressed close against her sides, their small bodies trembling. Clara wrapped her arms around them, sheltering them as she once dreamed of sheltering her own. She met Vikasa's gaze across the dim space between them. His face was carved in stillness, but in his eyes she saw the same thing she felt: fear. Sharpened into resolve, the bounty men entered the canyon. Their voices echoed off the stone, ugly and mocking. "Tracks lead down here." One barked, "Like catching rabbits in a pen." Another jeered. Clara held her breath, her nails digging into her palms. The girls clung tighter. The men's boots clattered on rock, and the creak of saddles followed. Their horses urged along. The canyon floor. Vikasa's hand touched the stone wall beside him, steadying himself. He waited until the men drew close, until the canyon funneled them into its narrowest throat. Then, with a speed that startled Clara, he moved. He climbed. Jagged outcrop like a mountain cat, his body flowing upward with strength born of desperation. He vanished above, and for a moment Clara feared he had abandoned them. Then came the crash. A boulder, loosened by his hands, tore free and tumbled down. Then another. The canyon roared as stone struck stone, echoing like thunder trapped in a drum. The bounty men shouted in panic. Horses reared and screamed, their hooves striking sparks against rock. One lantern fell and shattered, fire sputtering before the dust smothered it. The men scrambled, But the canyon betrayed them. Rocks rained down, filling the air with grit and choking shouts. Clara pressed the girls' heads against her chest, shielding their eyes, her own mouth full of dust and fear. When the echoes faded, silence rushed back deeper than before. Clara opened her eyes. Through the haze, she saw the men sprawled in. Chaos, their horses bolting down the canyon, their rifles scattered useless in the dust. Vicasa dropped back to the ledge, his chest heaving. He did not speak, but his presence was steady, unbroken. His daughters ran to him, clutching his legs, their tears smearing dust into his skin. Clara rose shakily. She met his gaze, her throat tight, her palms raw with grit. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another, two people, bound not by words, but by the weight of what they had done together. When they left the canyon, dawn was breaking. The sky was painted in rose and gold, and the prairie stretched endless once more, cleansed by the night's violence. Clara walked beside Vicasa and his daughters, her steps slow but sure. She was no longer only the woman rejected, cast out like refuse. She was the one who had cut the nets, the one who had shielded children, the one who had lured death toward herself so others could live. She was not powerless anymore. Vicasa paused on the ridge and looked at her, the wind tugging at his hair. His eyes were softer now, filled with something she could not name. Gratitude, perhaps. Recognition. A promise unspoken. The daughters took her hands as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Their small fingers curled around hers, binding her to them with a strength no net could match. Clara lifted her face to the morning sun. The prairie had once been nothing but silence and exile. Now it was something more, a place where she belonged, not by birth or by the judgment of others, but by the bond she had forged in the shadows of the canyon. The wind carried their steps onward. Whatever lay ahead, Clara knew she would not walk it alone.